Welcome aboard the dark waters of the Night Crew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Night Crew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Night Crew, the show where we explore the world's darkest true crime cases, unexplained mysteries, and the stories that continue to haunt us long after the headlines fade. Imagine a crime so shocking that it made international headlines. A man admits to killing another person. Police find overwhelming evidence. There is no question about who committed the crime. Yet, he is never convicted, never serves a prison sentence, and eventually returns home as a free man. So how could that even happen? Was it a failure of the legal system? Maybe even a consequence of international law? Or something far more complicated? Today, or tonight, we are traveling back to Paris in 1981 to examine the case of Issei Sagawa and the murder of Renée Hartevelt, a crime that shocked the world and continues to raise difficult questions about justice, mental illness, and accountability more than 4 decades later. To understand how this case unfolded, we first have to look at the man at the center of it. Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949, in Kobe, Japan, into a very wealthy and well-respected family. Issei's father, Akira Sagawa, was a successful businessman and the president of a large Japanese company involved in the grain and milling industry. The Sagawa family was considered very popular, socially acceptable, and well connected in Japan. Because of his father's position, Issei grew up in a financially comfortable household. He attended the most prestigious schools, and his family was able to support his studies abroad in Paris. So he was a very spoiled boy growing up. From the outside, the Sagawas appear to live a comfortable, privileged life. But Issei was physically frail from an early age. He was born prematurely and, reportedly, struggled with health problems throughout his childhood. He was much smaller than other children, something he later said contributed to feelings of insecurity and isolation. Now, for this case, it was really hard to find information about him. I don't know if it's because it's in Japan, so it's a different country. But either way, I went on Reddit and I found some things about him as well through my research. And so, as stated by r/true crime on Reddit, they said Issei said that when he was in the 1st grade, one day he saw the thighs of one of his male classmates and thought to himself how delicious his meat could be. This was the first time that Issei felt an interest in cannibalism, although he did not realize it at the time due to his young age. And then that user also says he also partook in bestiality with his dog, which I don't even know how he ended up being this way at such a young age. No abuse or anything, but abuse doesn't define a serial killer. It really doesn't. He was just messed up in the head from a very young age, let's just say that. So as he grew older, Issei developed a fascination with literature and foreign languages. He was intelligent, soft-spoken, and academically gifted, eventually studying English literature before continuing his education abroad. Years later, Issei would claim that he had experienced violent fantasies from a young age. These statements came after his arrest, and while they offer some insight into how he described his own past, it's important to remember that they come from the perpetrator himself and cannot always be independently verified. Again, I'm going back to r/true crime again. They state, this is what Issei states that they're stating. One night in Tokyo, Issei, at the time 24 years old, secretly enters the house of a German woman. According to him, he wanted to take only a piece of her buttock meat and take it with him to eat. Basically, like carry out. It was interesting that he said, I wanted to do this in a way that she would not notice. How? I do not know, to be honest. But due to Mr. Issei's misfortune, the woman wakes up and starts screaming. Security guards and police stormed the house and arrested Issei on charges of attempted rape. But what no one noticed was that Issei did not want to rape the woman. He wanted to eat her. He was such a strange man. Mr. Sagawa does not make himself obvious and confirms the rape charges. Of course, his father quickly compensates the plaintiff and frees his little boy. End quote. In the late 1970s, Issei moved to Paris to pursue a PhD in comparative literature at the Sorbonne. To those around him, he appeared quiet and reserved. Fellow students often described him as polite, intelligent, and unassuming. Few, if any, suspected the thoughts he later claimed had been building for years. In Paris, he lured sex workers to his home almost every night, but failed to kill anyone until he met a student at the university he was attending. She was a 25-year-old Dutch woman named Renée Hartevelt. Renée had come to Paris as an exchange student. Friends described her as kind, bright, and very passionate about literature. Like Issei, she loved books and language, making it easy for the two to strike up conversations through their shared academic interests. Over time, Issei became acquainted with Renée. He would later tell investigators that he admired her and asked if she could come to his apartment one evening to help him practice German by reading poetry together. It sounded like a simple request between classmates. Renée accepted the invitation, unaware that it would be the last evening of her life. Renée arrived at Issei's apartment in Paris after accepting his invitation to help him practice German by reading the poetry together. To her, it appeared to be an ordinary evening between classmates who shared an interest in literature. After attempting to murder her once before, so she had gone to his apartment previously, tried to kill her, didn't work. But then on June 11th, 1981, he crept up behind her as she was reading poetry to shoot her in the neck with a rifle he'd bought and kept hidden. There are conflicting accounts about how he obtained the gun, and he fainted at the sight of her pooling blood, he said in later interviews. Over the following days, it gets worse. Issei remained in the apartment with her body. During police interviews, he admitted that after he awoke from fainting, he essayed her corpse. He then ate parts of her flesh, both raw and cooked, which is absolutely disgusting. Again, another quote on Reddit, r/truecrime. It says, "At first, Issei tries to bite her flesh with his teeth. But, he says, my teeth were not sharp enough. That's why I went and bought a butcher knife." Issei begins to eat the corpse and stated, "I will never forget the moment I ate the first piece of meat. It was a historic moment for me." He later said that his only regret was that he could not eat her meat when Renée was alive. "No one believes me, but my ultimate goal was to eat it, not necessarily kill it." And this is a human being, and he's just saying it like she's an object, which is horrible. Onward with the quote, "He eats a large part of her face and breasts at the same time, and stores the rest of her meat in the freezer of his house. At each stage, he photographed Renée's body. This takes 2 days." End quote. These details have often been emphasized in media coverage because of their shocking nature, but they're not necessary to understand the facts of the case. What mattered most to investigators was that Issei openly confessed to the homicide and that the physical evidence supported his statements. Several days later, Issei attempted to dispose of Renée's remains in Paris's, this is French, don't judge me, Bois de Boulogne. This was, or is, a large public park on the western edge of the city. Carrying suitcases late at night drew the attention of nearby witnesses, who noticed his suspicious behavior and blood dripping from the suitcases, so they contacted the police. By this time, Renée's family had reported her missing. When officers arrived, Issei fled the scene, leaving the suitcases behind. Inside, investigators found evidence that quickly led them back to his apartment. When detectives searched Issei's apartment, they found a scene that confirmed much of what he had already confessed. The murder weapon, blood evidence, Renée's belongings, and photographs taken by Issei himself all supported the investigation. He was arrested shortly after and taken into custody. Unlike many notorious murder investigations, there was no prolonged search for a suspect, no complicated forensic mystery, and no courtroom drama over guilt or innocence. Issei admitted responsibility almost immediately, and investigators had substantial evidence to verify his confession. Issei said, "Nobody believes me, but my ultimate intention was to eat her, not necessarily kill her. I killed her to eat her flesh." For French authorities, the central question quickly shifted from who committed the crime to, was the suspect mentally capable of being held criminally responsible? That question would determine everything that followed. By the time Issei was arrested, French investigators had little doubt about what had happened. After his arrest, his father, Issei Sagawa, used the family's financial resources to retain lawyers to represent him. Of course he did. They had money, they got the best lawyers they could. Having experienced legal counsel was important because the case involved serious criminal charges and later complex psychiatric evaluations. Issei had confessed to killing Renée, and the evidence collected from his apartment supported his account. In many murder cases, this would be the point where prosecutors prepare for trial and a jury determines guilt. But this case took a very different path. Rather than focusing on whether Issei committed the crime, the French court turned its attention to a different question. Was he mentally capable of standing trial and being held criminally responsible? Psychiatrists were asked to evaluate Issei. After examining him, they concluded that he was suffering from a severe mental disorder at the time of the offense. Publicly available records do not clearly identify one definitive clinical diagnosis from the French evaluations. Much of the court record remains sealed. Some diagnoses discussed were basically a psychiatric category involving atypical sexual interests associated with distress or harmful behavior. Some experts have discussed cannibalistic fantasies within this context, though cannibalism itself is not a standalone diagnosis in the DSM-5. And then they speculated he had personality disorder traits, though there has never been a clear public consensus on a specific personality disorder. And some reports suggested psychotic symptoms, while others questioned whether he had a true psychotic disorder at all. So based on those evaluations, the investigating judge ruled that Issei was legally insane under French law and unfit to stand trial, which is ridiculous. That decision changed everything. Because he was found not criminally responsible, there would be no public murder trial, no jury verdict, and no criminal sentence. Instead, Issei was committed to a secure psychiatric hospital in France for treatment. For Renée's family, the decision was devastating. The man who had admitted to killing their daughter would never face a criminal court. But the story wasn't over. A few years later, after discussions between French and Japanese authorities, Issei was transferred to Japan so he could continue psychiatric treatment closer to his family. I don't even know how that was allowed. That's ridiculous. Laws were different back in the day, same within different countries. Many assumed that once he arrived in Japan, prosecutors there would finally put him on trial for what he did. Instead, another legal complication emerged. Because the French court had already declared Issei legally insane and closed the criminal proceedings, many of the investigative records remained sealed. Without access to the full case file and with no French conviction to recognize, Japanese prosecutors concluded they could not proceed with a murder trial. Issei remained in a psychiatric hospital for further evaluation. Eventually, doctors determined that he no longer met the legal standard for involuntary commitment and he was released. The result stunned people around the world. A man who had admitted responsibility for one of the most infamous killings of the 20th century was no longer confined to a hospital or even a prison. Legally, the case had reached a dead end. To many, it felt unimaginable. To others, it exposed the difficult balance between criminal justice, mental illness, and international law. When Issei was released from psychiatric care in Japan, he did not return to a normal career. His father reportedly continued to support him financially, allowing him to live without needing traditional employment for much of his adult life. If I knew my son had did that to someone, I would cut him off so fast. I would give him no money. His family had way too much money and power. I don't think they even cared what he did, even though he confessed to all of it. People couldn't understand how a man who had openly admitted to killing Renée could be living freely out on the streets. But legally, the situation had become incredibly complicated. France had determined that Issei was not criminally responsible under its legal standards at the time of the offense, and Japan ultimately did not prosecute him after his transfer. Whether people agree with those decisions or not, the result was the same. Issei was no longer confined. What happened next shocked many people just as much as the legal outcome. Issei wrote books and drew anime about his actions and cannibalistic desires. He also enjoyed a stint as an on-screen celebrity, starring in several pornographic films, where he reenacted his crimes and appeared on cooking shows eating raw meat. He also sold nude paintings of women. His notoriety turned him into a public figure in Japan, something that many people, including victims, advocates, and members of the public, found deeply upsetting. Oh, it's so gross. Critics argued that the attention shifted the spotlight away from Renée, the young woman whose life had been taken. It raised difficult ethical questions that still resonate today. Should people responsible for notorious crimes be given a public platform? No. And where should the line be drawn between public interests and sensationalization? In his later years, Issei's health declined. Following a stroke, he largely withdrew from public life and required assistance with daily living. He died in 2022 at the age of 73, that was pretty recent, a few years ago. More than 40 years after the murder of Renée, this case continues to challenge our understanding of justice. Can someone admit to killing and still never face a criminal trial? How should courts balance severe mental illness with accountability? And what responsibilities do the media have when covering notorious offenders? There are no easy answers. What we do know is that Renée Hartevelt traveled to Paris to study literature, pursue her education, and experience the world. Those who knew her remembered her as intelligent, kind, and full of promise. Her life deserves to be remembered for far more than the crime that ended it. Thank you again to everyone for listening to this episode of The Night Crew. If this case made you think, I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you believe the legal system worked as it was designed to, or do you think justice was never truly served? Me personally, I think it is bullshit the way the case was handled. He should have been in prison for life, maybe even gotten the death penalty. Cannibalism is a horrible thing. I even saw an article where he spoke about, I believe it was Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, and how it was all about eating human meat and whatnot, and he looked up to him. This man should have died. He should have. But let me know your thoughts and opinions, and if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider following the podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. We just started the Facebook back up again. And please, please, please remember to share it with someone who loves true crime and the mysteries behind history's most controversial cases. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next episode where we will be diving into the dark web.